Hello, everybody. My name is Odell Horne, and I'm the president of the North Georgia Conference United Methodist Men. And I want to welcome you to this very special Black History Month program, Slavery, Methodist Missionaries, and Indigenous Christianity. In our first program, we talked about early African Christianity, and we had some professors from Yale University and Concordia Seminary in St. Louis talk to us about Alexandria and Carthage, Axum, St. Matthew, St. Mark, St. Augustine, St. Athanasius, and how Africa helped to shape the Christian mind. In our second program, we talked about with one of the professors from the University of Georgia, how in the 16th and 17th century, Christianity was rejected by Africans when the Portuguese slave traders came. However, by the 18th and 19th century, Christianity began to grow, particularly through the efforts of missionaries from the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And then we also talked about African indigenous churches or African independent churches, how they grew, particularly in the 20th century through first prayer bands, and second through Pentecostalism. Today, we're going to bring our conversation to the United States, and we're going to talk about slavery in the United States, Methodist missionaries, and how Africans indigenized Christianity. So the first thing we have to do is we have to deal with historical facts. We've got to deal with history honestly. You may have heard that the first Africans in America came as indentured servants to Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. Well, that's not true. The first Africans came to America was named Juan Garrido, and he was with Ponce de Leon looking for the Fountain of Youth. And he wound up in what is now St. Augustine, Florida in the year 1513. Henry Louis Gates, professor of African American Studies at Harvard University, in 2013 sponsored or hosted a program on PBS called African Americans Many Rivers to Cross. And Dr. Gates' very first episode in this 6-part series was the Black Atlantic. And he opened with the story of Juan Garrido, the first African in America. He then goes on to talk about Estevanico. You may know him as Esteban the Moor. While Juan Garrido was a freedman, Esteban the Moor was a slave. And he traveled through Texas in the 1520s and is buried outside in New Mexico, and he died in 1539. But his heroics are legendary. And he was one of the many Africans in America in the 16th century. Now, I know some of you may be stating to yourself, well, wait a minute, Odell. Florida wasn't a part of America. It was part of the Spanish Empire, and it wasn't a part of the original 13 colonies, and neither was Texas. And I understand that completely. However, based upon the historicities, the Americas was north and south, and there was no British claim to the land. So therefore, in African American studies, and most historians in African and American studies, believe that the first Africans arrived in the 1500s. But we'll go with the 1619 narrative if you so wish. Understand that Africans did not convert to Christianity until the first Great Awakening in the 1730s. In the 1730s, an Anglican priest named John Wesley came to Savannah, Georgia, and stayed for 3 years. He was largely unsuccessful as a missionary, but he preached against slavery and preached that African slaves should be included in the ministry of the gospel. But it wasn't until a fiery Britishman and co-laborer of John Wesley, George Whitefield, came and preached. He was so passionate in his preaching that many slaves were moved to become Christians, For the first time in more than 100 years of slavery, there was a mass turning of Africans in America to Christianity. See, between 1619 and the First Great Awakening, the main churches in the United States were Presbyterian, Anglican, and Congregational. And in order for you to become a member or a Christian in one of those churches, you had to know how to read and write, because you had to go through catechism. And the secular laws of the British colonies in the United States, or what would become the United States in the Americas, forbade slaves to learn how to read and write. So for more than a century, slaves in America could not become Christians because they did not go through catechism. It wasn't until Baptist and Methodist missionaries, primarily through the First Great Awakening, and then in the Second Great Awakening in the 1790s, that slaves began turning to Christianity, because the message was that you don't have to go through catechism, you can experience God right now. John Wesley was so moved by the plight of slaves in America that he actually wrote a book on it. The Thoughts Upon Slavery was published in 1774, almost 4 decades after Wesley left Savannah, Georgia, and returned to England. He was truly what we would call an abolitionist. In 1784, at a Christmas conference, the Methodist Episcopal Church was established, and among those in attendance were RIchardAllen and Absalom Jones, Francis Asbury, and Thomas Coke. The Methodist Church would be an inclusive gathering of whites and blacks, freemen and slaves. That was until one day at St. George's Church in Philadelphia, Absalom Jones and RIchardAllen went to the altar to pray, and they were removed from the altar. RIchardAllen was so incensed that he would eventually start his own church, a congregation within the Methodist Episcopal Church. This congregation would eventually become known as Mother Bethel. And in 1816, Allen would start his own denomination, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Now, there's some important details to this story. The first is, if you didn't notice, there was slavery in Philadelphia. See, you may have been taught that slavery was a Southern problem, but that's historically inaccurate. Slavery was legal in Pennsylvania, and it was not outlawed until the Gradual Abolition Act was passed in 1781. But even then, slavery was still in practice up until the 1820s in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. As the story goes, there was also slavery in New York. Beginning in 1626, there was a Congo market on Wall Street. A Congo market is code for slave market. And it was slaves who built the wall on Wall Street. Slavery was legal in practice in New York State up until 1827. And in 1821, after much discrimination happening in Methodist churches in New York City, some freemen and some slaves formed their own congregation and formed their own denomination, which is now known as the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. More background to the story of RIchardAllen and the church in Philadelphia: it would eventually be sold by the Methodist Episcopal Church. However, Allen had built such a large congregation that the congregation would buy the church back from the Methodist Episcopal Church and then go on to start the African Methodist Episcopal Church in 1816. While the Methodist Church would eventually split in 1844 over the question of slavery, between northern churches and southern churches, particularly the question of whether a bishop could own slaves, one has to note that George Whitefield also was a slave owner. The legacy of slavery has been a stain in Methodist history. Methodists would go on to fight each other in the Civil War over the question of slavery. In 1939, Methodists came back together to reunite. And in 1968, the Evangelical United Brethren united with the Methodist Episcopal Church. However, one of the legacies of the reunion in 1939 was the formation of the Central Jurisdiction. The Central Jurisdiction was a jurisdiction for Black churches all across America, from Boston to Miami to San Diego to Seattle. And as a requirement of joining the Methodist Episcopal Church, the Evangelical United Brethren demanded that the Central Jurisdiction be disbanded. However, the damage had been done. Much like what had happened to RIchardAllen in the selling of his church, the Methodist Church in the 20th and the 21st century had a legacy of selling Black churches. According to a pastor in Atlanta, some of the charges that the Methodist Episcopal Church had against Black churches was to take their clergy away and offer them higher salaries by putting them in positions in the connection, selling Black church properties in predominantly Black cities and towns, charging the same percentage of apportionments from Black and white churches, despite Black income and wealth being significantly lower than that of whites, selling Black congregation the properties of white churches, which are too expensive to maintain, and selling Black built properties after churches close, with the annual conference getting the money instead of using it to minister to those left in the community. This stain has left a bitter taste in the mouth of many Black Methodists all across the country. But in the 1960s, an answer would come. In 1968, while watching the riots at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, James Cone would begin the work with what would become his seminal classic, Black Theology and Black Power. Cone would attack the presuppositions and understandings of theology as being taught in the academy in the United States. However, Cone's own brother Cecil would critique his work in his 1975 work called Identity, Crisis, and Black Theology. Cecil called out his brother James because he felt that his theology was not rooted in Afrocentrism, but was still perpetuating historical criticism, which William H. Myers, in the book Stony the Road We Trod, would call the most Eurocentric methodology of biblical interpretation. According to Reverend Raphael Warnock of Ebenezer Baptist Church, the Black church has a divided mind between those who followed the Eurocentric higher criticism and those who followed Afrocentrism. But make no mistake about it, whether it's Harry Hoosier or RIchardAllen or Absalom Jones or AME pastors like James Cone or Cecil Cone, Africans in America took Christianity and indigenized it and made it their own. However, the question was raised about Pan-Africanism. See, in the 1960s, most African nations had overthrown their colonial oppressors. And Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, and Haile Selassie of Ethiopia were household names in the Black community. Yet the Black church didn't have a relationship with the church in Africa outside of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. As the Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie reigned for more than 30 years, and he made more than 5 trips to the United States. Here he's seen with Adam Clayton Powell Jr. at Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. Yet, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was the only, or one of the very few, clergy who would meet the Emperor of Ethiopia. At the heart of Cecil Cone's critique was a critique not only of historical criticism, but that the Afrocentric, theological, Black church, African-centered psychology and history was not included in Black theology. The other argument was that it wasn't Pan-African. Cecil didn't state that, but many people implied it. See, in the 1960s and the 1970s, dashikis and Afro picks was the look for many African Americans, except for the Black church. Now, there were some Black churches where you could wear your dashiki and an Afro pick, but for most, and it's this lack of Pan-Africanism that has led to a disconnect between Black people in the academy and Black people on the street and Black people in the pews. Of the Black denominations in the United States, only the African Methodist Episcopal Church in the 21st century continues to maintain connections with churches on the African continent. And while there are United Methodist churches in Africa today, one can't help but notice that there's a lack of communication that's going between Black churches on both sides of the Atlantic. This is unfortunate. However, as travel and communications have advanced in the 21st century, and many African Americans have gone back to the motherland, our ties are growing stronger. The United Methodist Church and its predecessors have played a vital role in the evangelization of African slaves and Africans on the continent. What will the future role be like? My name is Odell Horne, and I'm the president of the North Georgia Conference United Methodist Men, and I want to thank you for listening.